Okay, before we move on to First Amendment issues in Section 7 and 8, I'd like to talk a little bit about transgender rights, which is actually a very growing and dynamic area of the law at the moment. Um, it's still unclear how far the courts are going to go and what's going to happen in these areas, and there is a lot of litigation that, again, is coming up through the courts presently, and I think we'll see a number of these cases come before the court in the Supreme Court in the next few years. Um, Two cases that I'd like to talk about. One is Gloucester County School Board versus Gavin Grimm, which got all the way up to the Supreme Court and all the way back down to the Federal District Court and had quite the case record in history. And then the other one is a case that just came down in June of this year called Bostick versus Clayton County. And both of these have to do with, in various formats, with transgendered rights or the rights of openly homosexual folks. Um, Needless to say, there have been great developments in the law in these areas. The states and many cities and towns and counties are far ahead of the federal government in defining rights for transgendered people. And in many places, the states have already amended, and cities and towns have amended their civil rights laws to include prohibiting discrimination because somebody is a transgendered individual. The federal government, in large part due to the fact that the Democrats and the Republicans can't talk to each other about anything whatsoever at all at this point in time. I don't know how many years it's been since we've actually had a real budget agreed to by a majority of the people in Congress and signed by a president. As you can see right now, to date this video to 2020 in October, Nancy Pelosi and President Trump and Mitch McConnell are engaged in a roll-on-the-floor fistfight over extending further aid to people in light of the COVID-19 pandemic crisis. And they can't even come to agree that, gee, we need to keep people from being evicted from their houses and we need to make sure their children have food to eat. They can't agree about that. So how, in God's name, can we expect that they are going to agree about anything that has to do with some fairly fundamental changes in how society looks at people, how it judges people, how it deals with people? So what has been happening, again, cities, towns, states have been moving rather quickly to add transgendered to the group of suspect classifications, in the sense that you're not allowed to discriminate based on that. They've been amending their civil rights statutes to include these people within the protection of those statutes, and they have been trying to move forward while the federal government is stuck in a morass and is 35, 40 years behind the times in what it's doing. Now, both of these cases, Gloucester County School Board versus Gavin Grimm, is a case where a person was transitioning from one gender to another. They were a high school student. The parents of Gavin Grimm let the school know over the course of one summer that their child was transitioning and wished to be treated by their chosen sex in the coming school year. And the school initially agreed to that, even to the point of saying that Mr. Graham could use the boys' bathrooms and locker rooms, even though he had previously been a female. This went along fine until school started, and some parents found out that this was happening and that the school officials were taking this view of things, and they went to the school committee complaining, and the school committee immediately passed a number of regulations which basically would prohibit Gavin Grimm from living life as a male and from acting as a male and using male facilities within the school building and school facilities and school activities. Needless to say, Mr. Grimm's parents sued. The case went on so long. Initially, this was a Gloucester County versus a kind of John Doe, because Mr. Grimm was a minor and they did not want to publish his name. It went on so long that Mr. Grimm, I think, I know he is now an adult and maybe a college student at this point. And the case wended its way through the federal courts for years up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court basically did not make a substantive decision, but sent it back down to the lower federal courts to deal with. And ultimately, a lower federal court, a federal district court judge, ruled in favor of Mr. Grimm and against the school department. So basically said that the regulations as passed by the school department violated the civil rights of transgendered people. This was not a constitutional case. What was at stake here was something called Title IX. Now, Title IX is a federal law that says that any school department that receives federal funding must ensure that the sexes are treated equally. There were very big issues with this going back 15, 20 years ago, when the federal government used this statute to really clamp down on colleges and high schools where they had fantastic sports programs for men and kind of almost non-existent rinky-dink sports programs for women, and spent tons of money on the male sports program and almost nothing on the female sports programs. And basically, the federal government used this rule to say that these schools, and this includes colleges and universities if they receive any type of federal funds, any type of public schools, even private schools that receive, if they're receiving any kind of federal funding, and if they're receiving state funding, then that usually involves federal funding that's been given to the states, even if the town or city's not getting it directly. Title IX says that you have to have equal facilities and that you have to ensure that both sexes are treated equally when it comes to whatever programs, whatever things you are running, even to the point of physical facilities like gyms and bathrooms and workout areas and practice fields, all of those good things. Now, the issue here, Gavin Grimm's lawyers sued on the basis of saying that transgenderism is an issue that has to do with sex. And since Title IX guarantees equality between members of different sexes, that idea is broad enough to encompass transgenderism. There's some argument that can be made against that on the basis of when the Title IX was passed, certainly transgenderism and even homosexuality or lesbianism were not major issues within the society. They certainly were not, if you went back and looked at the history of the legislation, they were not what was being discussed or talked about by the people who proposed the legislation or voted on it. And they were not until the Obama administration came along and passed some regulations saying that they interpreted Title IX to extend to transgendered folks. Prior to that time, nobody had thought of it doing that. And the argument against Mr. Grimm was that if Congress wants to extend this protection, then all they need to do is change the statute and add the word transgenderism to it, but that the word sex as defined when it was originally written to the statute at that point in time had nothing to do with transgenderism, and you're now reinventing history that didn't exist in order to broaden the definition of a word that never meant what you're now saying it's going to mean going forward. Again, if we were living in sane political times, these things would iron themselves out politically, and there would be action within the activity within the Congress to change these terms, to broaden the definitions of protection. But under our present system, bogged down as it is between the various warring parties, it's unlikely that's going to happen. And as has been going on in the last 100 years of our history, whenever the politicians refuse to deal with an issue, and the stresses get greater and greater and greater over the issue, people end up in the courts, and as happened with abortion, the courts end up making a decision that probably should have and could have been made by the legislatures, but was not. Right? So that basically is what happened here. And again, As I said, it went up and down the federal court system a couple of times and finally reached the point where the federal district court judge had the case back and ruled against the school committee and basically said that this was a situation where, yes, the Title IX should be interpreted to include transgendered people. In Bostock versus Clayton County, there was, again, just like within Obergefell, there were several cases dealing with these issues that were all brought together in one consolidated case. And these had to do with Title VII, which is the anti-discrimination law when it comes to employment and employment practices. Now, there were three cases combined here. Bostock was a county employee who was fired after he tried to organize a gay softball team among his fellow employees. Altitude Express versus Zotter was also a case of dismissal due to sexual orientation. And then RG and GR Harris Funeral Home versus the Equal Opportunities Commission was a case where an employee who had transitioned from one sex to another was fired after they transitioned. And basically, it became clear from the evidence that the fact that they transitioned was one of the major reasons for their firing. Now, here again, the Title VII statute lists a whole different series of suspect classifications that cannot be the basis for an employer refusing to hire someone or for firing someone, and they included the typical things that we know: race, color, religion, sex, national origin. But the issue here again was, does the word sex in Title VII, which is part of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, so we're going way back in terms of when the law was written, does sex, the word sex, is it broad enough here to encompass homosexuality, and is it broad enough to encompass transgender, protection for transgender folks? And again, the argument was that in 1964, these were not issues. Nobody was thinking about them. Certainly the people that wrote this statute did not envision that the statute would ever be used for this, and that if these areas were to be covered, homosexuality and transgenderism were to be covered under the protections of the statute, that it should be done by way of folks going through the legislative process and amending the statute. The court disagreed with that rule, and the court found that the word sex can be interpreted broadly enough to include concepts of homosexuality, lesbianism, transgenderism, and that therefore whatever protections are afforded under the statute includes folks within those groups as well. One of the very interesting things here, which kind of plays on what's going on in front of the Senate right now with the Amy Coney Barrett hearings, is that not only did he agree with, but Judge Gorsuch, who was Donald Trump's first appointment to the court and was touted as a conservative judge who was going to turn everything back to the 19th century and get rid of Roe v. Wade and do all kinds of horrible things, Judge Gorsuch not only voted in favor of expanding the definition of this statute, he wrote the decision to support it. Much to the chagrin of the president, I'm sure. But just goes along with my theory I talked about a few lessons ago, where it has been written, it has been studied by some law professors, that interesting things happen to people once they are appointed to the Supreme Court, and once they get there and realize, oh my God, if I want to be, I'm here for the rest of my life. Nobody can tell me what to do. Nobody can cut my salary. I am free to make the decisions that I want to make. So here, only several years after his appointment by Trump, we have Gorsuch and Chief Justice Roberts, who was also appointed by a conservative Republican, joining the four more liberal judges to come out with a 6-3 decision in favor of redefining the Civil Rights Act to include homosexuals, lesbians, transgendered people, and to include them in the protections that were created in 1964, when I think you'd have a very hard time making an argument saying that it was the intention of the original writers of the statute to include these. But this is a very good indication of how judges sometimes work, how their own theories develop and change. And because these statutes existed, these two cases were pretty much based upon interpretation of statutory law. They did not have to get into the actual due process, equal protection arguments of Obergefell or Masterpiece Cake Theater or a number of the other cases that we've looked at before that. They could be left pretty much to statutory interpretation. Although it is very interesting that in one part of the Gavin Grimm case, somewhere along the way, his lawyers actually picked up on language in Obergefell where the court talked about protecting the individuality of people, that we have a right to our own individuality, to our own individual destinies, and to make choices about that. And at one point when they were arguing, and of course lawyers always argue in the alternative, so even though the cases were decided pretty much on statutory bases, I'm sure the lawyers threw in arguments about equal protection and due process in the 14th Amendment. It's very interesting that already the lawyers have begun to pick up on the idea that Obergefell has created or has crystallized an idea of individual liberty and individual identification of who you want yourself to be, that probably goes beyond just the mere idea of the right to privacy. We will have to wait and see how these things develop. All right, that's it for this segment. As I said, we'll next be moving on to dealing with First Amendment issues. Over and out.